Yes, and I think you're making a really good point, Kyle. I actually call that the rent control mentality.
Right,
And
right.
I've lived in New York over 40 years, and I've met many of these long-term rent control tenants, and it does something to their psychologies. It's not good. They become fearful and static. They're afraid to move to that bigger city, move to another neighborhood, get a bigger apartment to live decently for their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it is. And it creates such a dependency on their landlords. They don't own their property. They have a lifetime tenancy, but they don't own it. The landlord provides their appliances, but they're going to be lousy, crappy appliances. They're subject to the landlord maintaining the building. The landlord has no incentive to maintain it well. They have to fight with the landlord. It's not psychologically healthy to be living as a long-term rent-controlled tenant.
Hi, welcome to Making Infrastructure Pay. I'm Kyle Kirschling, and today we're speaking again with Raymond C. Niles. This is part of a series on housing abundance and rent control, and today we're going to talk about the ethics of rent control, and we're going to also steelman rent control and talk about some of the arguments that are made for it. Ray is from Wall Street. He's got a background, a business and investment background. He worked in electric utilities, so there's that infrastructure aspect to his background, and he's also got a PhD in economics from George Mason University. He teaches economics at St. John's University here in New York City, and his research interests include, quote, monetary theory and history, financial economics, entrepreneurship in the business cycle, and Austrian economics. So thank you again for being here, Ray.
My pleasure, Kyle.
So I wanted to talk more about the ethics and morality of rent control and really some of the injustices that it inflicts. And I think last time we talked a bit about how it is sort of strange in a way that it puts all the affordable housing is kind of a societal problem, but it makes it the landlord's problem. But there are other ways.
Yeah, we talked last time about really how it's unfair to landlords who own property where the value of their property in some cases gets reduced to zero when the cash flow turns negative, when costs of operating exceed your rent revenue. And that's how New York City lost 1 million people in the 1970s. So it really is an injustice towards the landlords, but it's a real injustice towards the tenants too. And they suffer in so many ways. One is they have very poor quality housing because the landlords can't afford to upgrade and maintain their buildings. They suffer from the lack of construction of new modern housing. So instead of living in buildings with elevators, with central air conditioning, maybe with amenities, like garages and maybe even pools if they're a little bit wealthier. Instead, they're in 18s, 5-floor walk-up buildings that should have been demolished decades and decades ago, buildings that were state-of-the-art when they were built in the 80s. So it really hurts tenants from substandard housing, from a shortage of housing, because if they can find housing, it's going to be very, very expensive. It's going to be those few unregulated apartments, and there's not enough construction of new apartments. The other way it's unjust is that it creates a winner and loser environment among tenants on many levels. One is it pits existing New Yorkers against newcomers because the newcomers have to pay those super high unregulated rents, whereas the existing, and they're basically subsidizing the apartments for the existing New Yorkers in their rent-controlled apartments. You could have in one building 2 identical apartments, and you could look up the rents. There are databases that have this. They're identical in every way, and one person is paying $4,000 a month for their 1-bedroom apartment, and right next door to them, someone is paying $600 a month for that apartment. And that's because of rent control. You don't find that in cities without rent control. People pay the same market rents, and they're not $4,000 a month. It's going to be much, much lower.
So within a building, it is odd. How else would you explain the fact that in the same building, I mean, there might be a little bit nicer in some ways, but the same building, same floor, even, or
same layout.
Yeah.
So the way you sort of gain if you're a tenant in New York is if you live in the same unit for a long period of time, because the rent regulations usually don't let rents rise that much, even lower than the rate of inflation. Over time, your rent becomes much, much lower than market rate rents, where they are allowed to go to market, through some of the loopholes in the laws. So that's how you basically have a tenant who's lived in a building for 20 years is basically paying a lot lower rent than the newcomer who just moves into the building.
Yeah, so it's like the rent control doesn't even really preserve low rents for in any kind of a fair way. It's just whoever happened to already be in an apartment and stayed there long enough then has this entitlement. But it's not like, well, these are the people who most need it or anything like that.
Well, you even have bizarre situations, like it could be a family that had 3 kids and they have a 3-bedroom apartment. And now the kids have gone off to college, and now the 2 parents are very elderly. They don't want a 3-bedroom apartment, but they can't leave because their rent is now so low relative to the market. So they're basically squatting on this enormous apartment. Normally they would have moved into a smaller apartment, and that bigger apartment would have been available for someone else. There are other ways that tenants get hurt, because since it creates a shortage of affordable apartments, one way to get them is through being on a long waiting list. I know people who've literally been on waiting lists for more than 10 years to find an affordable apartment in New York. You don't see that in cities without rent control. Now New York has a thing where they force the landlords to build a small number of reasonably priced apartments as part of a luxury development where the higher rents are subsidizing those below market apartments. But there's so few of those relative to demand that people have to either have a long waiting line or they do these lotteries. Whoever heard of trying to find a nice apartment? You have to be in a lottery where the odds are 1 in 500 of getting it. Most people don't get it. So if you're lucky, the lucky get the cheap apartments. The lucky who might know a landlord who might have a regulated apartment available. But for the vast majority of New Yorkers, especially those who are coming to the city now, they have to pay really absurdly high rents.
And I've got to think it's bad for the people who win the lottery or who have it, because they're just, the way their life is going to evolve. They're not going to move. They're not going to, they have a family, they're not going to want to find a bigger place because this is such a great deal. They're not going to want to take a new job opportunity. It just would seem to make you stuck in your life.
Yes. And I think you're making a really good point, Kyle. I actually call that the rent control mentality.
Right.
And I've lived in New York over 40 years, and I've met many of these long-term rent control tenants, and it does something to their psychologies. It's not good. They become fearful and static. They're afraid to move to that bigger city, move to another neighborhood, get a bigger apartment to live decently for their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it is. And it creates such a dependency on their landlords. They don't own their property. They have a lifetime tenancy, but they don't own it. The landlord provides their appliances, but they're going to be lousy, crappy appliances. They can't put in their own appliances. They're subject to the landlord maintaining the building. The landlord has no incentive to maintain it well. They have to fight with the landlord. And I find that, it's not psychologically healthy to be living as a long-term rent-controlled tenant. Yeah. It's one of those perverse things in New York. I don't know if you've seen the comedy show Seinfeld from the 90s.
Yeah.
A lot of people, and they have Kramer. He's the eccentric one who seems to have lived in his rent-controlled apartment for decades.
I see.
Kramer, listen, I got to talk to you about the lease. Oh, the lease. The lease. You want to talk about the lease?
You want to talk about the lease?
No. I'm not throwing you out of the place. I'm giving it to you.
Oh, you are, huh?
Yeah, I decided I'm going to give it up, and I'm going to give it to you.
What do I have to give you?
Nothing.
Nothing. Gee, I want to give you something.
Nothing.
Wait.
You?
Yeah.
Oh no, that's
take
okay.
I'll take the cigar.
No. Well,
you look tense. You look tense.
And he's delightful and funny and comical, but actually, a lot of times people develop sort of fearful lives. They're not.
Maybe that's why is the way he is.
It might be. It might be. Yes.
It's nuttiness. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about the kind of just the injustice or on this topic of that comes to mind? About how it hurts the landlords, clearly, because they bear all the responsibility in a sense for providing affordable housing, even if it's going to bankrupt them. And it's unfair to other tenants who are in because they're paying more to subsidize it. And even the way it benefits the last time you talked about trying to buy out this little lady for $1 million, something like that. Anyone who is trying to give affordable housing doesn't think that, well, she needs $1 million. They'd rather take that $1 million to help a few families or something. It's
right.
So it's on every level.
On every level. I mean, there are people who have a rent regulated apartment and it's way below market and they never live there. They just illegally sublease it at market rents to people. So all of this revenue should be going to the landlord so you could develop new properties. Instead, it goes into the pocket of that lottery winner.
Right. Which I guess at least it's better they're making it available. I lived in a place that was like that, and then I had to leave because the landlord or someone found out, and they had to come back. They were in a different country. They'd come back and move in to show that they were still there because they had to have that apartment. They couldn't let go of it. It was so important to them. I wanted to talk about just some of the other arguments for rent control. I mean, I think we've covered part of it. Some is just the idea that the landlords can afford it. I mean, they're rich. They're making this money. I mean, I suppose at the margins they can, but
until they can't. I'd say they can afford it until they can't. In the 70s, the landlords walked away from their buildings, but basically what we see is we don't see new landlords coming to New York, new development, that we just don't see that happening. That's the invisible cost is the lack of supply of new housing, which is why it ends up being so expensive here. But, as far as the arguments for rent control, I mean, it's bad economics. So it's hard to actually, I don't see a legitimate case for rent control.
I had one, though, I thought.
Okay, let's hear it. Yeah.
So I was thinking, because there's zoning, this is the best argument I could think of for rent control. Because there's zoning and these other restrictions on supply, you're almost sort of creating monopoly rents for the landlords. So maybe you should regulate it sort of almost like a public utility. It's like, okay, well, we're kind of giving them a monopoly. They can charge high rents, but we're going to kind of keep a lid on it like you would a public utility.
Yeah. So if I understand your argument, you're saying the zoning laws, which prevent tall buildings and density,
sort of
so it chokes off the supply of new housing,
right?
Which if we had no rent control, the rents would be higher because of the lack of supply of new housing. So therefore, we need to regulate the rents because of the problematic effects of zoning.
The monopoly,
That's a good argument for eliminating zoning. Eliminating zoning. So I would say it's sort of like the solution creates new problems of its own that don't solve the original problem. The real problem is the lack of construction of new housing. Rent control reduces the incentive to build new housing. Zoning, by law, restricts the supply of new housing. We want more housing. I mean, that's the only way to bring down rents, to bring down the cost of housing, is to have a greater supply of it. It's simple supply and demand. So zoning and rent control act in different ways, but they both effectively restrict the supply of new housing. Politically, there's a good argument for rent control, is that it buys votes.
For people who live here today,
a winner.
Right?
It's a winner. And especially if the market rents are so high because of rent control, the way I've explained, because it chokes off the supply of new housing. Tenants don't want to move out and vacate apartments, all of those different things. People see that it's very difficult to come to New York. You have to pay very high rents. So if I say I'm going to restrict rents, what people in their minds think is that, I can find an apartment now at a lower rent. Yeah. But it's not going to exist. It's not going to be available because rent control causes a shortage of apartments. Those apartments will not exist. You can't magically wave a wand and make them exist. Now, if you're an existing tenant, if you're an existing tenant, you don't want your rent to go up. So, for example, if we bring in, let's say our leading mayoral candidate, Mayor Zohran Mamdani, he says, I want to freeze rents during the 6 years of his mayoral administration. Basically, he's bringing us back to the 70s. Costs are going to go up due to inflation. Now, if you're in one of those apartments, you're not going to notice the effects right away. But
because inflation is lower than it was in the 70s, that's part of what maybe accelerated
so it'd be the effect we saw. But eventually you're going to notice, gosh, my landlord isn't answering my calls as fast as he used to. I can't
have a new landlord now
I have a new landlord. He's not so nice to me anymore. It's taken me 2 days to get my toilet fixed. Who are those weird people he moved in next door? They seem like thugs. Right? You begin to see things like this happening. God, it's cold, it's winter, the heat. What's going on with the heat? They're not going to connect it to rent control because they don't know this. They don't know what we're talking about. They're going to say, I hate my landlord. Zing them more. Roll back the rents. But that's going to make the problem even worse. So politically, unfortunately, playing off people's ignorance, rent control is, I think it makes political sense. So that's why it's very hard to eliminate it once it goes into effect. Very hard to take it.
I wonder if some of the people, it's just they're concerned maybe about specific individuals or thinking, what about poor Miss X? How is she going to afford to live here? I mean, I don't know. What do you say about that for that situation? If they're worried about some.
Well, I'd say, who is that? So if it's X already in an apartment building, their rent will be made more affordable, but their apartment will suffer less maintenance, right? If it's the new Miss X, that they're going to have to pay much, much higher rents than if there were no rent control, because rent control's choked off the supply of new housing. So for the newcomers, what you can't do is you can't create artificially low rents and have available apartments. That's an impossibility in economics. If you push the price below market, you create a shortage of that good, whether it's bread. In Venezuela, they put in price controls throughout the economy. Before, there used to be bread on the shelves, eggs on the shelves, meat on the shelves. Then the supermarkets were empty, and the only place you could get bread or eggs or meat was in the black market. We have that kind of thing in the housing market in New York. In the early days of rent control, there's something called key money. Key money. So it'd be like you had to give a cash payment to the landlord to get the key. It might be $5,000, $10,000. In some places I heard it was as much as $100,000. So in a way, it's good. It's like a way around rent control, but you have to basically bribe to find it. So if you care about that poor person who can't afford a good rent, you want to get rid of rent control because it will bring down market rents and the apartments will be available, right? And it's good for tenants today and tenants in the future.
So instead of freezing it, maybe this would be a good time to talk about kind of a thought experiment. If you were to just get rid of it, you keep the other regulations. We have zoning and those other, but you eliminate the rent control, and maybe to make it a little more realistic, say you give to the people who today have a rent controlled apartment, you give them like a lump sum of money, and maybe it's like equivalent to what their market rent would be for 3 years or something. So in this hypothetical, the people in the rent controlled units now they could afford to stay there because they'd be given this money, but everyone would have to pay the market rents. Yeah. So how would that play out, do you think?
I think rent control needs to be ended. So right now, it's interesting. There's a big lawsuit by the Rent Stabilization Association, which represents rent-regulated landlords, and I think another housing association. It's going through the courts right now, and it's saying that rent control is unconstitutional because it represents a seizing of property without compensation. Now, we have our eminent domain laws, which says the government can seize property for public use, like building a road, but they have to provide compensation to the owner. Rent control is uncompensated seizure of property. I mean, to the point where all value is taken away if the property goes to zero, like it did in the 70s, right?
And it is, in a sense, it's a physical taking, right? That's part of the argument.
It's an economic taking.
Which is a little, because, I mean, eminent domain allows you to do a lot of different things, but you're not supposed to be able to physically occupy someone's property. You can regulate it to death and restrict all kinds of things which you could do with it. But if someone is there physically occupying, so the tenant is occupying the landlord's property, is that part of this argument as to why it's a taking? Because I think there used to be an exception. If you were a landlord, you wanted to live in the apartment, you could evict someone for yourself to move in. Well, they got rid of even that.
Yeah. I mean, basically, no, it's a taking because you take the economic value of the property. I mean, ultimately it could go to zero, right? So if the property would be worth $1 million, or let's say 10 million, where you could charge market rents, but over time the costs, go up, but rents are not, and the value of your building goes down, 900,000, 800, 700. If you value a building today, you look at what percentage of the apartments are regulated versus market, and the values depend on that. The more regulated tenants, the lower the value of the apartment. That's a taking.
Yeah,
that's a theft, of the value of the property. But like what you were talking about, like this idea that if you want to occupy if you're a landlord, you want to occupy one of the apartments, it could go to market rent. That loophole did exist, and actually, if you look at the real gnarly reality of New York City rent regulation, there's constant desire of landlords to get out of rent control because it's eating them alive.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the ways you could get out of rent control was you could convert your building to a co-op. Now, a co-op, for those of you who aren't in New York City, it's only a New York thing. You only see it in New York. It's kind of like a condominium, but it's technically different. You own shares in a corporation that owns the building, rather than owning your unit outright, like a condominium.
Whereas a condominium, you have a sort of a title that like these walls and it's your space, whereas a co-op, you sort of like are part of the owner of the building, and then it's decided what unit you get to live in, but you don't own that physical space in quite the same way.
Right. You own shares in the corporation that owns the building, and then you're given what's called a proprietary lease for that particular unit. Economically, it's like the same thing as a condo. So these are technical differences. But the interesting thing was there was a loophole to get out of rent control, which was you could convert your building from a rental to a co-op. And in the early days of the fees into the 60s, I think maybe even a little bit into the 70s, if you could persuade a certain percentage of the tenants to buy their apartment, you could evict all the rental tenants out of the building. And then you could sell the building to people who buy it at market prices. So what you're doing is you're getting out of regulated rents, which are eating you alive over time, and you're selling it to people paying market prices. So you could exit and get a market price for your building, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's the way the co-op law is. So when they did that, if you look in New York, there are thousands of these co-op buildings, Upper West Side, Upper East Side, large parts of Brooklyn. And basically they were the best rentals. They were converted to co-ops. And so that was good because it got those housing units to be market housing. You're not going to have maintenance problems because you're paying for your own maintenance, right?
There's no rent control on owning a home. Like they don't have a cap on what you can sell your house for.
That's right. This is why most of the new construction today are condos, because there's no cap on prices for condos. But then then the landlords did this and they realized, oh my gosh, we're going to lose our regulated rentals because they're all going to convert to co-op. So they made it harder and harder and harder. And they did this by saying a higher and higher percentage of the tenants have to buy their units. So the landlords, in order to get them to agree, they had to offer it at lower and lower prices. Now, this is also like winning the housing lottery. You could buy your unit at a really low price and then flip it to the market. Well, the landlord's not getting that profit. So eventually they no longer found it profitable to do that. And eventually, that whole co-op conversion thing ended. So that's one way to get out of the rent regulation. And good, because it meant more capital going into the housing market at unregulated levels. But then, then periodically the city just loosened the rent laws. They had to do this because you had the abandonments of the units in the 70s. So we went to rent stabilization, which meant that rents could go up, at higher levels, not being just fixed flat. Then we had that luxury decontrol I talked about last time, when the rents are over $2,500. Now there's no shortage of luxury apartments. And most of the new buildings being built are luxury because we have kind of an unregulated market with those unregulated apartments. So, to the extent the housing market has functioned at all in New York is to the extent they've watered down the rent regulations.
So what would happen then if they were to completely do away with the rent control laws? And maybe offer some money to people who are in them now. But how do you see that playing out? Like if you just completely abolished it, but all the zoning, everything else stays.
It would be great. We'd see a lot more units. So we'd see several things. Existing apartments would have a more rational usage pattern. So it would be easy to find new apartments. That's one thing we have to realize. It'd be easy to find, there would just be market apartments. There'd be no such thing as below market apartments. Everything would be market. Right. So if you could, if it's $1,500 a month for a studio, that's what it is. I can go out and find the apartment, no big deal. So what this means is existing stock would be used more rationally. So imagine that, I think I mentioned it last time, a couple, they have a family, they raised a family of three, and it might be a 3-bedroom apartment. The kids have moved out. We're under rent regulation. They're never going to want to leave because the rent's below market.
Yeah.
Well, now they can leave. They can find a cheaper studio or a 1-bedroom. It's available. They can actually find it. So that frees up that 3-bedroom for another family rather than being that 3-bedroom being off market. The other thing it would do is it would eliminate the problem of holdout regulated tenants who prevent new development. I mentioned last time, like that Bloomingdale's example.
Because of the way the rent control law here in New York, it sort of protects it's not about creating a supply of affordable housing. It's more about protecting the individuals who have this entitlement, right? The existing tenants. And therefore, to protect the existing people, you have to make it difficult to evict them. Otherwise, you're not protecting the existing people. So which leads to this problem of them being sort of a holdout. Even though they don't own it, they stop new construction.
You know what rent control creates? Legalized squatters. They're legalized squatters. It's like the Roach Motel. You move in, you can never get them out, So they move in with a 1 or 2 year lease. They gain a lifetime tenancy that lasts in perpetuity that they can pass on to their heirs. How does that make any sense? So you'd free up lots of land for development. So even with zoning,
the sites,
which restricts the height of buildings, the reality is there's so much unbuilt capacity, even under our existing zoning laws. But we don't have development now because of these locked-in rent control tenants. So it would free up a lot of land for development.
Probably in more convenient areas, because I think a lot of it gets pushed to the waterfront industrial areas where there are not tenants. So it could be more, to the extent there's zoning capacity available, which there is some. Yeah. The development could happen in more convenient areas.
That's right.
And I think that people, if you were to give someone in a rent controlled apartment and you were to give them, you said you have to start paying the market rent today, but I'm going to give you the difference between what you're paying now and what the market rent is. I think they would probably pretty soon decide they want to move. They would rather keep that money and do something else with it, that it's not worth it for them to stay in that apartment. For most people, I bet.
Yeah. So like how you transition out of rent control, it's like anything. I think it would be wrong to just snap your fingers and have all the rents go to market because people would have to move. A lot of people would have to move around below market. But you could say, for example, you could have some kind of subsidy arrangement you're talking about, where you give cash to, and then maybe they could use it with a new market apartment, so they have an incentive to move. You could have vacancy decontrol. So this was tried in 1968 when inflation was so bad and the abandonment problem was really picking up steam. They allowed the rents to go to full market when the tenant left. But one problem they discovered, when it would jump so quickly, let's say from $600 to $2,000 a month, it created a huge incentive to harass the existing tenants to get them to move. So another way is maybe you could say the rents go up a lot, 20% a year
until they get
up to a certain amount. Another thing you could do is you could maybe have a schedule of landlord buyouts. So where the tenant doesn't have complete veto authority, the right to reject any offer to buy them out, where you have that example of that tenant, Bloomingdale's, basically asking for $2 million to leave and then never left, or that one who wanted to take over the equity in the apartment. But you could say it's $50,000. If the landlord gives you $50,000, it's not a voluntary offer. You're going to have to leave after a year or two and accept the buyout. So these are ways you could transition out of rent control. And maybe after 5 or 10 years, it's sort of like how slavery ended. In the North, slavery was abolished completely voluntarily. There was no war required. All of them. Some states like Massachusetts eliminated slavery all at once. Now, morally, I think we'd want slavery to be eliminated right away. But other states like New York said that slavery will end.
Anyone born after this date or something would be,
But, I use that comparison with slavery. Slavery, you're stealing a person's life. But in our Declaration of Independence, it says you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The original draft said the right to life, liberty, and property, because it was understood. How do you pursue your happiness if you don't own your property, if you don't have the right to your property? The landlords are having their property taken away from them with rent control.
So by phasing it in, you're continuing this injustice to them for a longer period. Let's see, I had one other thing I wanted to ask you about. In terms of what would happen to the rents? I think a lot of people would be interested in that. I mean, you mentioned some other cities that it's like, what, 40% higher here or something than other big cities. I mean, is that maybe what you might expect to see happen? Like the rents would, if they're 40% higher here, then the reduction would be.
Well, they're much higher than that. Actually, so market rents in New York are, I would say probably, typically like a double what they are in unregulated cities like Miami or Chicago or places like that. I was saying that my estimation is that, based on my own sort of subjective, is that rents, for example, in Chicago, which is, one of the largest cities in the United States, are probably 40% of New York's rents. And the quality of the housing is much higher. You don't get walk-ups. They're all, every building has an elevator, most of them in Chicago, like New York. But what would happen is market rents would fall. The regulated rents at the very lowest ones would go up, but the overall level of rents would fall to reasonable, sustainable levels that people could afford.
Because you would have a huge increase in the supply of housing, because I'm guessing most of the people who are living in the rent-controlled units, probably, even if you gave them the money to pay the rent, even if they could afford it, probably it wouldn't be worth it to them. So you would like double, like almost like within a year or two.
And then there'd be lots of construction of new apartments.
Right, because it would allow construction.
So what would happen is, the way I would say it is that rents would be equalized. You wouldn't have different rents for the same units, and the average rent would be affordable. It would be much cheaper to live in New York for the vast majority of people. It'd be much, much cheaper to live in New York.
I mean, and I have seen, this was a while ago, but some figures on office space comparing different cities. And I don't remember exactly, but the office rates, per square foot are not that much higher in New York City than, say, Houston. I assume that that's partly because, and I think it's partly maybe the zoning, there's not as much NIMBYism because an office building owner doesn't care if an office building is built next door. That's fine. That's a good thing. Like a resident might care, but there's no rent control in the commercial rent.
We don't hear about shortage of office space. And I know with, in the post-COVID era, people are working at home. So there's like a surplus of offices right now. But, before that time,
there was no shortage.
New York built, I've read like, in 1 year, New York City would build more housing than like in all the commercial office districts, like in the rest of the country combined. I mean, it's an enormous number amount of new office space. So the office rents are reasonable, and there's no shortage. Meaning, if you want to start up a business, you could just easily find an affordable office space. That's not true for housing in New York. The difference is regulation. Housing rents are not regulated. How about a storefront? You want to start up a retail store? Knock on some doors, go to a broker. It's easy. You can find the storefront very easy. There's availability of storefronts of reasonable rent because it's unregulated. Now, it's ironic because actually Mayor Giuliani in the 90s, who was the one who allowed the decontrol of the rents above $2,500 a month, he proposed regulation of retail rents. He wanted rent control for storefronts. Now, imagine if we did this. You'd have, let's say, this business, and they're not selling anything that people want. It's a poorly run business.
Their biggest asset is their rent-controlled space, essentially,
because their rent is lower than anyone else on the block, and there are people dying to move in with an innovative new store selling stuff that people want, a new restaurant. You want to start up a new restaurant. You can't find it. You can't find the retail space because rent control has locked in these people, these uneconomic retailers. That's like an analogy, but we don't have that problem because we don't have rent control for retail spaces.
Well, that's great. I got to end it. We're out of time for today, but thank you. That's our show. It was great speaking with you, Ray. And we are going to continue on this housing abundance and rent control. So if you have questions or comments about this issue, the things we've talked about in this video or the other video, please leave the comments. We're going to look at it and respond to it. We're very interested in your feedback. So until then, I'm your host, Kyle Kirschling, and thank you for watching.